The courtroom was quiet, almost too quiet, as the doors creaked open and Maria Walker stepped inside the small but well-worn space, her heels clicking softly on the cold linoleum floor. All eyes turned toward her, but it wasn't the kind of gaze that sparked respect or recognition. It was the kind of look that met a stranger in an unfamiliar place, a quick scan of her figure, followed by disinterest, and then a return to whatever had been going on before her arrival. Maria didn't mind the stares. She'd long since learned to ignore such glances. They were commonplace for women like her, women who carried power, but had to fight every day to be seen for who they truly were. She had earned her place in Congress, had spent years fighting for the rights of marginalized communities, speaking out against the injustices that so many preferred to ignore, and yet here in this courtroom she was no different than any other defendant facing the same small-town judge and his rigid rules. Judge Harold Winters sat at the front of the room, his stern expression never faltering as he peered down at the paperwork before him, his glasses perched at the tip of his nose, his eyes scanning the documents with the detached efficiency of someone who had long since lost interest in the individuals who appeared before him. He had seen hundreds of cases like this one, traffic violations, misdemeanors, small infractions that never left any lasting impression in his memory. He barely looked up when Maria approached the podium, his mind already made up. He took a cursory glance at the case file. The name seemed unfamiliar, but that was irrelevant. As far as he was concerned, her identity mattered little. What mattered was the rule of law. The fine had been set for speeding in a residential zone. The penalty was clear, and he would not make exceptions for anyone, not even a woman with an unfamiliar name who looked like she had places to be. Maria remained calm. She had seen this kind of treatment before from people who assumed they knew her story. From the moment they saw her, she could already tell from his posture and his dismissive tone that this was going to be one of those encounters, but she had no intention of letting him dismiss her without a fight. Instead, she met his gaze with quiet resolve. Judge Winters spoke, his voice cold and clipped, reprimanding her for speeding. He lectured her about the importance of adhering to the law, no matter who one was, as if she needed reminding of the consequences of her actions. His words dripped with condescension, and Maria held herself steady, listening, as though this wasn't the first time she had been scolded by someone who couldn't see past their own biases. He continued to speak as though she were a child who needed to be taught a lesson about respect and responsibility, and all the while Maria remained silent. She knew this wasn't about the law. It was about him projecting his own assumptions about her, someone who looked like she didn't belong in his courtroom, someone who probably didn't belong in his world at all. When he finally handed down the sentence, a hefty fine of $500 and a requirement for community service, she didn't flinch. She accepted it without protest, her face betraying nothing but quiet anger beneath the surface. But as the judge turned his attention to the next case, she noticed a subtle shift in the room. The whispers had already begun, a soft murmur of recognition, the court officer's eyes darting to her face, then to each other. Judge Winters had no idea yet, but soon enough he would. As Judge Winters moved on to the next case, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, though he remained oblivious. Maria stood at the podium, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression still unreadable. She could feel the heat of the stares, the quiet shock beginning to spread through the room. There was a shift in the air, a change that wasn't yet fully understood but was undeniably palpable. The whispers were growing, not about the case, not about the fine, but about who she really was. Maria's mind was elsewhere, calculating the best way to handle this moment. She had been underestimated countless times in her life, by men, by colleagues, by entire systems, and she had learned that the best response was often silence. But today, something felt different. The weight of history, the burden of what her identity meant in this context, pressed on her chest. She had fought for justice for so many years, yet here she was, being treated like just another defendant in a courtroom. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about something far deeper. The court officers, one by one, started to recognize her. First, a glance, then a knowing look exchanged between them. Maria had learned long ago to carry herself in such a way that her strength and conviction spoke louder than her words. But the officers, though they might have seen her name on the docket, had no idea who she truly was. The murmurs continued, and with each passing second, Maria felt the energy shift even more, an undercurrent of realization making its way through the room. It wasn't long before one of the officers leaned toward another, their whisper barely audible but still enough to travel across the rows. "That's Maria Walker." "The Congresswoman," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. The other officer's eyes widened, and he quickly turned to the rest of the courtroom staff. There was a sense of urgency now in their movements, like the realization had shaken them to their core. They began to glance at the judge, at Maria, at each other, and back to the judge again. Judge Winters, for all his authority in the courtroom, didn't pick up on the change. His eyes remained focused on the next case, the next infraction, the next name. He hadn't even looked up from his papers when Maria had entered, too distracted by the monotony of his routine to notice something, or someone, out of the ordinary. He had no clue what kind of storm was brewing right under his nose. The officer's whisper grew into a ripple, moving quickly through the room. The courtroom's energy seemed to crackle as the truth spread. Maria Walker, the Congresswoman who had fought for civil rights, racial justice, and the very system that this judge operated in, was standing before him, being dismissed with the same cold indifference as any other traffic violator. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Maria herself. It was a reminder of how the world still struggled to see her, really see her, not just as a figurehead or a politician, but as a woman of substance, as someone who mattered. Her mind began to churn with thoughts of how this moment would play out. Should she confront him now? Should she wait and see how long it took for him to realize who she was? She had fought her whole career to be more than just a name, a title, a label. She wanted to be recognized for the work she had done, for the changes she had fought for, not just as a congresswoman, but as a person. But the judge didn't see that. Not yet. He didn't see her power, her influence, or the legacy she was building. Not yet. But it was coming. Maria could feel it. Soon enough, Judge Winters would be forced to reckon with the truth that he had failed to see. And when that moment came, it would change everything. The question was, would he learn from it, or would he remain blind to the very things that made him so much like the system he upheld? Broken, indifferent, and blind to the power of those who didn't look like him. The clock ticked on, and Maria remained still. The storm was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it hit. The moment Judge Winters realized who Maria Walker truly was, time seemed to freeze. It wasn't just the sudden recognition that jolted him. It was the crushing weight of his own mistake. He had been too quick to judge her, too wrapped up in his routine to see the truth standing right in front of him. As he looked up from the docket, his eyes widened in disbelief, and he quickly glanced around the courtroom, hoping to confirm what he had just heard. The room, once buzzing with quiet whispers, fell into an almost eerie silence. Maria stood at the podium, still, composed, her face a mask of calm as she watched the judge's every move. The recognition seemed to hit him like a brick wall, his brow furrowing, his posture stiffening. For a brief moment, his eyes locked with hers, and she could see the realization dawning on him. His face, which had been impassive and authoritative, now showed clear signs of panic, though he tried to mask it behind his glasses and stiff demeanor. The whispers intensified, now circulating through the courtroom like wildfire. "That's her, the Congresswoman. Maria Walker," came the hushed voices. "She's in Congress. She's a leader." Why didn't he know? Judge Winters cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but his words came out choppy and unconvincing. Mrs. Walker," he began, fumbling with the papers in front of him, clearly not sure where to go next. I must apologize for the confusion here." His eyes darted nervously between Maria and the rest of the room, unsure how to address the situation without making it worse. Maria didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him with an expression that was unreadable to the others, but in her eyes, there was a quiet storm brewing. She knew exactly what had happened. She had been reduced to a simple violation, a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, her skin color and her gender shaping how she was perceived. She had seen it too many times before, but now, in this moment, she had the power to reveal the ugly truth behind it. With deliberate slowness, Maria stepped forward to the podium, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of everything she had worked for. Judge Winters, she said, her tone sharp but controlled, let me make something clear. This isn't about a speeding ticket. It never was. She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The room was holding its breath. You see, I'm used to being underestimated, she continued, her eyes never leaving his. People like you assume they know me based on how I look, how I present myself. But I've spent my life fighting against assumptions like that. I don't need your apology. What I need is for you to see me for who I really am. Her voice grew stronger with each word, but it was not a shout. It was the quiet power of someone who had been silenced for too long. Judge Winters, visibly flustered, opened his mouth to speak but found himself at a loss. What could he say? What could he do? The weight of his ignorance hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, he realized that his position of authority didn't shield him from his own biases. He had been too quick to make assumptions, too blind to see the woman standing before him, not as just a defendant, but as a person who had fought her entire life for the very rights he took for granted. I've dedicated my career to public service, Maria went on, her voice unwavering. I've spent years advocating for those who've been treated unfairly, and yet you couldn't even recognize me as your equal in this very courtroom. She stepped back slightly, her eyes now sweeping across the room, where the audience was watching with rapt attention. This is not just about me, Judge Winters. This is about the countless black women who are overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected because of how they're perceived. You didn't see me as a congresswoman, as someone who spent years making change. You saw me as a name on a piece of paper, as just another case to dismiss. There was a long pause. Maria's words hung in the air, and the judge, now deeply uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. His face was flushed, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for his gavel. But he didn't strike it. Instead, he lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. In that moment, Maria realized something important. She wasn't just speaking to Judge Winters. She was speaking to the system that allowed people like him to exist without accountability, to treat her and others like her as invisible, unimportant, or unworthy. But she was not going to let that stand. I don't need your apology, she said one final time, her voice carrying the strength of her entire career. But I do need you to understand the real lesson here. She turned to leave, her head held high, and as she did, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. The storm had only just begun. Judge Winters sat motionless at the bench, his fingers drumming lightly on the surface as Maria Walker's words echoed in his mind. For the first time in his career, he felt exposed, vulnerable. He had prided himself on being impartial, on sticking to the letter of the law, but in that moment, it was clear that his adherence to the rules had blinded him to something far more important. He had made a mistake so glaring that it couldn't be ignored. As Maria turned and began walking toward the exit, the tension in the courtroom seemed to linger in the air, thick and heavy. The audience watched her, some with admiration, others with quiet surprise. But no one moved. The judge, still reeling, knew he couldn't let this moment pass without acknowledging the truth. He had to correct the wrong, even if it meant admitting his own shortcomings. Clearing his throat, Judge Winters finally spoke, his voice shaky but determined. Mrs. Walker, he began, his tone hesitant but earnest. I owe you an apology. The words seemed to struggle to leave his mouth, but once they did, they hung in the air, a public acknowledgement of his failure. I made a mistake, and I didn't take the time to understand who you are. That was wrong, and for that, I am sorry. The words felt empty, like a hollow attempt to make amends. Maria paused, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to hear the apology. She had heard apologies like that before, spoken too quickly, without real reflection. But she wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. This wasn't about her. It was about the systems that had allowed people like Judge Winters to perpetuate their biases without ever having to face the consequences. She turned back slowly, her expression unyielding, her eyes fixed firmly on him. It's not just about your apology, Judge Winters, she said, her voice calm but steady, cutting through the stillness in the room. It's about understanding why you made that mistake in the first place. She took a step forward, her presence commanding attention. You didn't see me for who I am because you were too quick to judge me based on my appearance, my race, my gender. You assumed I was just another defendant, someone who didn't matter. Her words were measured, but they carried the weight of years of injustice. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had nothing to say. What could he say? The truth was, he had seen it happen all too often in his courtroom. He had seen people dismissed not because of the law, but because of their status, their background, their race. And in his own blind adherence to a system that had failed to check its biases, he had done the same to Maria. You have a responsibility, Judge, Maria continued, her gaze unflinching. You are entrusted with the power to decide the fate of others. But that power is nothing if you can't see the humanity in the people who stand before you. She paused, allowing the full weight of her words to sink in. If you can't see me for who I truly am, then how can you claim to administer justice? The silence in the room was deafening. The judge sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he processed the full extent of his error. This wasn't just a public relations issue or a mistake to be swept under the rug. This was about the very core of how people in positions of power viewed the world, how they treated others. And Maria had just held a mirror up to that reality, forcing him to look at the reflection. As the judge slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers again, something had changed. The arrogance that had once colored his judgment was gone, replaced by something that might have resembled humility, though it was a humility born of discomfort and self-realization. I'll do better, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. I'll learn. Maria nodded once, sharply. It wasn't a victory dance. It wasn't triumph. It was just the bare minimum. You should, she replied, turning to leave the courtroom. We all should. As she walked out, the door closing behind her with a soft thud, the courtroom remained still. The audience, still stunned by the exchange, slowly began to stir, but no one seemed to know what to say. Judge Winters sat frozen, the weight of Maria's words pressing down on him. He had apologized, yes, but there was no quick fix, no immediate cure for what had happened. The damage had been done, but perhaps, just perhaps, this was the start of a much-needed change, a change that began with seeing the people in front of him, not as cases to be judged, but as human beings deserving of respect, regardless of their race, gender, or position. In the weeks that followed, the story of that courtroom encounter spread like wildfire. Local media covered the incident, and Maria's speech was quoted far and wide. It became clear that this was not just a moment of personal reckoning for Judge Winters. It was a cultural awakening, a call to question how biases have long been baked into the very fabric of the legal system. And though the road to real change would be long, Maria's words had planted a seed that would begin to grow in the hearts and minds of many who heard them. In the days that followed, the fallout from Maria Walker's courtroom encounter became a topic of discussion everywhere, from local coffee shops to political debates on national television. News outlets replayed the scene over and over, showcasing her poise and powerful words, while Judge Harold Winters' apologetic and fumbling responses were critiqued by experts, journalists, and everyday citizens alike. The story had become more than just about a woman getting a speeding ticket. It had evolved into a larger conversation about power, bias, and accountability in systems that were supposed to be fair. Maria's office, once filled with the usual hum of legislative work, became the site of a steady stream of calls, emails, and messages of support. From colleagues in Congress to grassroots activists, the outpouring of appreciation for her courage in that courtroom was overwhelming. But Maria knew that her actions weren't just for show. They were part of a long-standing commitment to calling out injustices wherever they arose, even the smallest of spaces. She sat at her desk, sifting through the messages. Some were from old friends, others from strangers who had been inspired by her stand against the judge's assumptions. But one email caught her attention. It was from a professor at a local university, someone she didn't know personally. The message was short but poignant, praising her for speaking truth to power and suggesting that perhaps it was time to organize a broader conversation on racial and gender biases in the legal system. The professor also proposed that Maria join a panel discussion that would bring together activists, legal professionals, and politicians to address these issues head on. Maria smiled as she read the message. The conversation that had started in that small courtroom was beginning to take on a life of its own. She knew the panel would be an opportunity to push for real change, to ensure that her words didn't fade into the background like so many others had before. This was a moment to create lasting impact. As the days wore on, Judge Winters found himself facing an increasing amount of scrutiny. His apology to Maria had done little to quell the public backlash. The local community, many of whom had been quick to dismiss her in the courtroom, now rallied behind her. There were protests, marches, and town hall meetings where people expressed their outrage, not just at the judge's behavior, but at the broader systemic issues of racial and gender discrimination in law enforcement and the courts. In a quiet moment, Judge Winters sat in his office, looking out the window at the town he had served for decades. The reality of the situation began to sink in. He had been part of a system that perpetuated inequality. The realization wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Winters knew he had to confront the reality of his own biases and perhaps change the way he operated in the courtroom. He couldn't simply apologize and move on. He needed to take concrete actions to make amends, both in his personal life and in his professional role. Late one evening, as the town buzzed with debate over his actions, Judge Winters called a meeting with his colleagues at the courthouse. He knew it was time to make changes. He couldn't change the past, but he could influence the future. He proposed a series of educational seminars for judges and court staff, focusing on recognizing and addressing implicit biases. The idea was met with mixed responses, some supportive, others skeptical, but Winters was determined. He knew that it wouldn't be enough to just acknowledge his mistakes. He needed to actively work toward creating a system that treated everyone with fairness and dignity. Meanwhile, Maria continued to leverage her platform to advocate for systemic change. Her speech in the courtroom had ignited a national conversation on racial and gender biases within the justice system. She took her place at the university panel, speaking with authority and insight, pushing for the creation of comprehensive programs aimed at tackling biases in courtrooms across the country. She called for more inclusive policies, better training for law enforcement, and a revaluation of the way judges were trained to assess people who came before them. Her work didn't stop at speeches or panels. Maria worked tirelessly with her team to draft legislation that would mandate bias training for judicial officers nationwide. She knew that the fight for justice was long, but she also knew that every step she took, every law she helped pass, every system she helped reform, was one more step toward creating a society where people like her, and so many others, were not judged based on assumptions, but on their merits. The public conversation continued to evolve, but now it was no longer just about the day in court when Maria Walker had been underestimated. It was about something much bigger, a shift in the narrative, a challenge to the entrenched power dynamics, and a call to make justice truly blind to the biases that so often tainted it. It was clear that, for many, this moment would become a defining point in their understanding of what it meant to be truly equal in America, and Maria was at the forefront of that fight. As the weeks passed, Maria Walker's voice only grew stronger in the ongoing conversation about racial and gender biases in the judicial system. The ripple effect of her encounter in Judge Winters' courtroom had spread far beyond her initial speech. It sparked debates in boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms across the nation. Her name had become synonymous with the fight for equity, and she was determined not to let that momentum fizzle out. Maria knew the conversation couldn't remain limited to public speeches and media interviews. Real, tangible change required more than just talk. It demanded action. She began working closely with a coalition of civil rights organizations, legal reform advocates, and grassroots movements. They pushed for national policy changes that would address bias in the legal system and ensure that judicial officers and law enforcement received the necessary training to challenge their assumptions. Maria had seen firsthand the damage that unchecked biases could inflict on individuals, families, and entire communities, and she wasn't about to let this moment slip into the archives of forgotten movements. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing drafts of the new legislation, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from a colleague in Congress, a fellow lawmaker who had worked with her on previous bills. Maria, the voice on the other end, said, "I've got something you need to see. It's about Judge Winters." Curious, Maria leaned forward. "What's going on?" "He's requesting a public forum, a kind of town hall, where he wants to discuss his own accountability and efforts to address bias within the court system," her colleague explained. "He's even asking for you to participate." Maria raised an eyebrow. Judge Winters had been under immense scrutiny ever since their courtroom encounter, and the idea that he was taking such a public step to engage in dialogue caught her off guard. It wasn't every day that someone in his position would willingly open themselves up to such public accountability. "Is this for real?" Maria asked, skeptical. "I think so," her colleague responded. "He's been meeting with community leaders and some of the folks from the civil rights organizations. He says he wants to be part of the solution. He's asking for your support." Maria exhaled slowly, unsure how to process the request. On the one hand, she had no interest in helping a judge who had so blatantly failed her and countless others. But on the other hand, she knew that true progress often came from the most unexpected of places. If Winters was genuinely committed to change, perhaps this could be an opportunity for growth, not just for him, but for the entire system. "I'll think about it," she replied, and with that, they ended the call. The next few days were a whirlwind. Maria met with several of her colleagues, as well as leaders from civil rights groups, to discuss the potential implications of such a public forum. There were concerns, of course. Some feared that Judge Winters might be trying to salvage his own reputation rather than truly confront the system that had enabled him. Others believed that engaging with him would allow her to hold him accountable in a way that could have a broader impact. In the end, Maria made the decision to attend. She knew that change wasn't going to come from avoiding difficult conversations. If Judge Winters was sincere about his desire to confront the biases that had shaped his actions, then she was willing to be part of that discussion. But she was also clear-eyed about her role. She would attend not as an ally, but as a voice of accountability, ready to challenge him, to push him, and to ensure that his words were backed up by actions. The town hall event was set for the following month. It was being held at the local community center, a place that had been the heart of activism in the area for decades. The room quickly filled with people, local residents, journalists, activists, and legal professionals, all eager to hear what Judge Winters had to say. Maria arrived early, dressed in a tailored suit that conveyed both her professionalism and her determination. As she entered the room, she was greeted with nods of approval from the attendees. Many had been following her journey since the courtroom incident, and they saw her as a champion of justice. She took her seat on the panel, her eyes scanning the room, knowing that the stakes were higher now than ever before. When Judge Winters finally walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. He looked different than the man Maria had encountered weeks earlier. His posture was more humbled, and he seemed genuinely nervous as he took his seat. For the first time, Maria saw him not as the judge who had failed her, but as a man who might truly be trying to learn and grow. The moderator opened the forum with a series of questions focusing on systemic biases in the legal system. Winters spoke candidly about his past mistakes, acknowledging that his position had shielded him from seeing the broader consequences of his actions. Maria listened intently, waiting for the moment when she could step in, ready to push in further. When her turn came, she stood, and the room fell silent. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. "Judge Winters," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I'm glad you're here today. But it's important that we don't mistake this forum for a way to absolve yourself of responsibility. This is about real change, not just words." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We need to see action. We need to know that you understand the depth of the work required to dismantle the biases you've been complicit in. You can't just say you've learned. You need to show us." The room was still. Winters, for the first time, nodded with understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." It was a beginning, small, imperfect, but a beginning nonetheless. The town hall had been a turning point, a moment where words were no longer enough. Mariah Walker left the event that evening with a sense of cautious optimism. Judge Winters had taken the first step by publicly acknowledging his biases and expressing a desire to change. But as Mariah had made clear, actions would speak louder than words. The crowd had been respectful, but the room was filled with skepticism. They had seen too many public figures make promises they didn't keep. In the weeks following the forum, Maria continued her work with renewed focus. The panel discussion with Winters had drawn significant attention, and she had used the momentum to push for legislation that would require more rigorous bias training for judicial officers nationwide. The bill was gaining traction, and Maria was determined to see it through, even as more hurdles appeared. Meanwhile, Judge Winters kept his word. He had begun taking part in workshops and discussions on implicit bias, sitting in on trainings designed to confront the very prejudices that had influenced his decisions for years. It wasn't easy for him. His reputation had been damaged, and many of his colleagues and friends were uncomfortable with the sudden attention he was getting. But Winters was committed to making it right. He didn't want to be remembered for the incident with Maria, but for how he used it as a catalyst to push for reform. His public statements were more reflective, and his actions became more transparent as he opened up about the difficulty of confronting his own biases and the flaws in the system that had allowed him to overlook them. Though Maria's influence was undeniable, she didn't let the spotlight distract her from the larger fight. As the legislative process continued, she faced fierce opposition from conservative lawmakers who resisted the notion that the judicial system needed to be overhauled. The pushback was expected, but it didn't deter her. Each challenge she faced was a reminder of how entrenched these biases were and why they needed to be uprooted. One evening, as she sat at her desk in the Capitol, reviewing the latest draft of the bill, her phone buzzed with a text message from her communications director. The text was simple, but its contents made her pause. Judge Winters has announced that he will be hosting a statewide conference on judicial bias next month. He's invited you to speak. Maria leaned back in her chair, surprised. It had been only a few months since the town hall, and now Winters was proposing a broader platform to discuss the issues they had raised. She had to admit she was intrigued by the gesture. Was this truly a sign of commitment on his part, or was it another attempt to save face? The message included a link to an article about the upcoming conference, and Maria clicked on it, scrolling through the details. The conference was set to include judges, lawmakers, and activists, all focused on improving diversity and equity within the legal system. Winters had invited not only Maria, but several other influential advocates who had been pushing for reforms. It was ambitious, and she could feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just a conference. It could be the launchpad for a nationwide movement. Maria knew the risk. She'd fought long and hard to get this far, and she wasn't about to give credit where it wasn't due. Still, the idea of a national conversation about judicial bias, especially one with Winters at the helm, was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. She had always said that change needed to be uncomfortable and challenging. If Winters was genuine about being part of the solution, she couldn't let fear of his ulterior motives stand in the way of progress. A week later, she agreed to speak at the conference. When the day arrived, she walked into the conference hall with the same level of resolve she had shown in the courtroom months before. The audience was diverse, representing a broad spectrum of legal professionals, activists, and community leaders, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Judge Winters was already on stage when Maria arrived, sitting at a table with other panelists. He greeted her with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared past. His demeanor had changed. There was no arrogance now, only a readiness to listen. Maria took her place at the podium, looking out over the crowd. As she spoke about her journey, the injustices she'd faced, and the ongoing fight for fairness, the audience listened intently. She laid out the vision for the future, one where the legal system was not tainted by bias, where judges and law enforcement saw people for who they truly were, not through the lens of preconceptions. She emphasized the importance of accountability, not just for individuals, but for the entire system that allowed such disparities to persist. When it was Judge Winter's turn to speak, Maria watched closely. He had taken a backseat in the discussion, allowing others to speak their piece, but when he finally addressed the room, it was clear he had been changed. I've learned more in these last few months than I ever expected to. He began, his voice steady but humble, and I know that my work is just beginning. I'm committed to making sure that what happened in Maria Walker's case is never repeated, but it will take all of us, working together, to create a system that lives up to its promise of justice for all. The room erupted into applause. For the first time, there was genuine optimism in the air. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step toward true justice, towards building a system that could be better than the one that had failed so many. Maria watched the crowd, feeling a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long, but the journey had started, and she wasn't going to stop until real, lasting change was achieved. Months had passed since the statewide conference on judicial bias, and Maria Walker found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The work wasn't easy, and the obstacles were plenty. Yet she could see the faint glimmers of progress in the cracks of an old, deeply flawed system. She sat in her office, reviewing the latest developments of the bill she had championed. It was gaining momentum, and more senators were starting to back it, but there were still those who resisted the sweeping changes she advocated for. Some argued that judicial bias couldn't be fixed by legislation alone, that it was too deeply ingrained to change in a few simple steps. Maria knew the battle was far from over, but she also understood that change rarely came without struggle. She'd seen the way public perception had shifted since her courtroom encounter with Judge Winters. What had once been a scandal, a moment of discomfort, had evolved into a pivotal movement for justice. People were starting to recognize that the issues she spoke about weren't just abstract problems. They were real, tangible obstacles that affected lives every day. Judge Winters had become a surprising ally in this fight. He wasn't perfect, but he had stayed true to his word. After the conference, he had continued to host forums, reaching out to communities that were often overlooked by the judicial system. His efforts were slow, and he had lost some of his former allies in the process, but he remained committed to learning and pushing for reform. Some critics argued that he was trying to salvage his reputation, but Maria could see that he was genuinely working toward redemption. And while she had once viewed him as an adversary, she now saw him as a reluctant partner, someone who, despite his flaws, had been moved by the truth she spoke. One day, as she was preparing for another round of meetings with lawmakers, Maria received an unexpected call from Winters himself. "Maria," his voice sounded on the other end, more serious than usual, "I think it's time we take this fight to the next level." Maria raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about how to build real, long-term solutions," Winters continued. "The workshops, the forums, they've been great, but it's not enough. We need a coalition, something broader. A movement that includes judges, law enforcement, and the communities we serve." Maria leaned back in her chair, considering his words. She had always known that this fight wasn't just about one judge, or even one case. It was about a system. "What are you proposing?" "Let's create a national initiative," Winters said with a sense of resolve. "Something that's more than just talk. We need to provide resources, training, and accountability for the entire justice system, from local courts to federal law enforcement. This can't be just a patchwork effort. It needs to be comprehensive." Maria felt a spark of excitement as she heard his proposal. This was the kind of systemic change she had envisioned all along. "I think it's time," she replied. "If we do this right, we could change the way the whole country looks at justice." Over the next few months, Winters and Maria worked tirelessly, forming a coalition of lawyers, lawmakers, activists, and community leaders. Their aim was bold: to create a nationwide initiative for judicial reform that addressed bias, accountability, and fairness. The coalition drafted a comprehensive plan that included mandatory bias training, transparency in judicial conduct, and new systems for tracking racial and gender disparities in court outcomes. Their proposal was met with resistance from several powerful lobbying groups, but the public was overwhelmingly supportive. The conversations they had sparked were now at the forefront of national dialogue, and Maria's message about fairness, empathy, and accountability had gained traction in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just for fighting anymore. It was a movement that had captured the hearts of millions. On the day the bill was officially introduced in Congress, Maria stood before a crowd of supporters, reporters, and activists, her heart pounding in her chest. The atmosphere was electric. She had fought for this moment, for the opportunity to change history. But she knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The battle for justice was ongoing, and this bill was one step closer to the vision she had long held in her heart. As she took the podium, Maria felt a quiet sense of pride, not for herself, but for the movement that had grown around her. She had started with a single, powerful conversation in a courtroom, a conversation that had sparked a chain of events she had never expected. And now here she was, standing before a crowd, about to push for a national reckoning with the flaws in the system. In the distance, Judge Winters stood among the crowd, his presence a reminder that even the most unlikely allies could come together for the greater good. Maria nodded at him from the stage, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had both come. The bill was introduced that day, but Maria knew the real work was still ahead. The fight for justice would continue, but this time there was a new energy in the air. The conversation had shifted. The system was starting to change, one law at a time. And Maria Walker was ready to lead the charge, knowing that the road ahead would be long, but the fight was worth it.